A map was there when man first walked on the moon. William Clark drew this map when he charted America's Northwest Passage with Meriwether Lewis. This is the planet Venus. It's also a map. Throughout history, maps have inspired adventure and warned of danger. They've been created as great works of art and to plot horrific carnage. They've also helped us get to where we're going.
In addition to geography, the map itself gives you an idea of what the technology was at the time that the map was constructed. We have maps in the past where there weren't great cartographic techniques and tools, and as a consequence, maps tended to be very simple, simply because people could not create a complex image. Today, with our advances in computer science and computer graphics, we can create very, very specific displays with great deals of complexity.
No place are the technological advances of cartography better demonstrated than in New York City. During the 20th century, New York generated an incomparable energy, stoked by the wonder of skyscrapers, the power of Wall Street, and the ever-present fear of crime. Violence tarnished the city's greatness. In the late 1990s, however, violent crime began to plummet. A key weapon in New York's war on criminals really wasn't a weapon at all, but a map. A 10-foot-long, interactive, computerized supermap system called CompStat.
This is revolutionary. I mean, most police departments in the world are now coming here to copy what we're doing.
CompStat is part of the greatest revolution in mapping since Columbus. Technology has taken the map from paper to cyberspace. Like traditional maps, CompStat is a geographical representation of an area, a visual display of streets and landmarks. But rather than being printed on paper, it is an electronic projection. CompStat looms above the NYPD's command and control room, crime-fighting nerve center of New York. The computers that power CompStat actually make it thousands of maps in one. At the push of a button and a click on a menu screen, CompStat can instantly display a wealth of updated crime information on virtually every block in the city.
We believe that these maps and the way we use them in this room through our CompStat system is largely responsible for the decline of crime in New York City.
Numerous icons represent all types of recent crime, including skyscrapers for shootings, dots for robberies, and triangles or kites for narcotic deals. The size of the icon represents the number of incidents. Color indicates the shift on which the crime occurred. The icons are also the subject of twice-weekly meetings, where the department's 76 precinct commanders are grilled by the city's police commissioners about crime.
When you see it on a map, they jump right off the page. They actually speak to you. You see a cluster of shootings in a 2-3 block area. You know instinctively something's going on. We use this information to question our commanders and find out who's involved. And then we ask the narcotics people. More often than not, you find out it's narcotics related. There's a bit of a turf war going on for control of these corners. Somebody got shot as they were trying to take over a corner. The retaliatory shooting is the other one.
Besides plotting crime, the CompStat map provides layer after layer of visual data related to those crimes. For instance, CompStat can plot all of New York's banks and automatic teller machines, prime locations for criminal activity. With a click on a menu screen, CompStat displays another important picture: a link between a rash of burglaries and possible suspects.
This is the border of the 67th and 70th precincts. The blue diamonds represent residential burglaries. The green squares that you see surrounding the burglaries are parolees, people on parole from state prison for burglary. The next logical question is, are any of these people here responsible for all these? There's a lot of burglaries happening, right, in this little L shape here. Is the precinct commander aware of it? Have we matched their prints to any of the latent fingerprints recovered at the scenes? Have you interviewed anybody upon release from prison? These are the obvious questions we ask.
CompStat can even display photographs and video of parolees or other suspects in criminal investigations. While the data contained in CompStat's memory banks can be obtained through written reports, it is the power of a map, a mosaic of information broken down by geographical reference points, that make it a success.
Our precinct commanders will tell you that it's probably the most effective way to know what's going on in their precinct. It really gives us direction and it gives us focus, and that's really what maps are used for.
Maps have been providing direction and focus for thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. Even the oldest maps share a commonality with CompStat. They're an effort to communicate. In fact, maps are one of the first forms of communication.
No one knows who made the first map, who tried to use a drawing in some way to represent here in relation to there. We don't know that, but we do know that it probably occurred well before people started to write. So when you look back at some of the old maps, you're really looking back into the minds of people at that time, how they conceived the world they lived in, what they knew, what they imagined, what they didn't know. So it's another way of looking into the history of human development.
Maps are thought to have emerged throughout the prehistoric world, before people could even perceive of civilizations outside of their own.
Maps have been made probably out of any medium you can think of. There are petroglyphs, paintings on rock that are thought to be map-like. There are all sorts of documented stories of indigenous people making maps in sand and piling up dirt to form hills and explaining how to get from place to place like that.
Centuries before Europeans explored the Pacific, Marshall Islanders made maps by lashing sticks and seashells together. The sticks represented prevailing winds and wave patterns, while the shells indicated islands. Footprints showed the route from one village to another on pre-Columbian Mexican maps that were drawn on dried tree bark. It is believed that the Babylonians made the first world maps in the 6th century BC, though the Babylonians' view of the world was limited to the ocean shore.
Someone took a stick or some sort of writing instrument and etched in the clay the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and in a circular ocean out around there, and then baked the clay to preserve it. So that was a map.
By the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire stretched across Europe and into Africa. At a time when all roads led to Rome, the Romans were the first to make road maps.
Romans were obviously vitally interested in roads because they had this huge, far-flung empire, and what tied it together were these wonderful roads that they'd built.
One of the largest collections of antiquity maps resides at Chicago's Newberry Library. Included in the collection is a 5th century reproduction of a 1st century AD Roman road map. Originally printed on animal skins, the map is a 15-foot-long scroll.
It really shows the whole road network of the empire from Europe all the way to the Near East and all of North Africa, as if it were sort of compressed into this long, narrow band, kind of like modern subway maps. And they have the little notches, little jagged lines on the road indicate a day's march. You could calculate how long it would take you to get from place to place.
Roman road maps span the gap between primitive prehistoric maps and those that would be based on scientific principles. Yet, a cultural revolution would suppress scientific map-making for hundreds of years.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
With those historic words, President John F. Kennedy accelerated what would become the world's second great age of discovery.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
The Apollo missions to the moon were both triumphs of engineering and the human spirit.
God bless all of you on the good earth.
They also culminated in one of the greatest achievements in the history of cartography, the precise mapping of an area where no human being had ever stepped foot. Without an accurate map of the moon's crater-pocked and boulder-strewn surface, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin could never have safely landed their lunar module.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Early maps of the moon had been made from Earth ever since Galileo looked through his primitive telescope in 1610. Of course, the power of telescopes improved exponentially into the 20th century. But finding a safe, smooth surface to land a spacecraft on required a closer look. The effort took 5 years and involved 3 different series of spacecraft. But the most important mapping data was obtained by 5 unmanned lunar orbiters launched between 1966 and 1968. Each was equipped with 2 separate 70-millimeter cameras. One camera took wide-angle images to create a mosaic of the moon's surface. The other camera, equipped with a telephoto lens, took high-resolution images of potential landing sites. The 5 orbiters took a total of nearly 1,500 photographs. They were electronically beamed back to Earth and constructed into a series of maps.
See you coming down the ladder now?
Small-scale versions of the maps actually traveled with the astronauts who used them to help navigate landing sites. While the successful lunar landings opened the door to a new range of possibilities for the science of cartography, they also relied on principles that were established centuries earlier. Between the years 125 and 150, a Greek scholar named Ptolemy became the first to apply science to map-making. He recorded his theories in a book titled Geography.
He enunciated the scientific principles for cartography, the idea of using mapping to scale, the idea of perspective, the rough idea of coordinates, having grids on maps, all these things that we take for granted in mapping today. Ptolemy enunciated this. Now, he didn't know, and the people at that time didn't have the abilities to put into practice all of these principles, but they were there on paper or on papyrus to lead the world later on.
It would have to be much later. All of Ptolemy's contributions to cartography would be lost for centuries. Much of the world's scientific knowledge, including Ptolemy's, was archived at the library in Alexandria, Egypt. In 391, Christian mobs destroyed the building and its contents. As the world entered the Dark Ages, map-making was assigned to monks. Suddenly, European maps represented not geography, but theology. The earliest of these new maps were called TO maps. The T symbolized the cross, with the 3 known continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, at each station. The O was the circular ocean that the monks believed confined the world. TO maps grew to be far more complex and elaborate, but maintained their biblical perspective. This is a replica of a map from the year 1240 that was so large it was painted on the wall of a monastery in Edsdorf, Germany. The original was destroyed in World War II.
Here's the Mediterranean. You see, if you think of the T&O map, it's still got the basic T&O shape. The top, the Mediterranean here is the stem of the T, and the bar of the T is the Nile River and the Dardanelles and the Black Sea.
The head of Christ is at the top of the map, his feet at the bottom, and his hands at the sides. He is literally holding the world within his embrace. The holy city of Jerusalem is centered in an area referred to as Umbilicus Mundi, the navel of the earth. Besides the known lands, the map also illustrates the biblical location of the Garden of Eden. This 15th century TO map, where the continents are named Ham, Shem, and Japheth for the sons of Noah, was one of the last of its kind. But it's significant for another reason as well. It was the first known map to be produced on the mechanical printing press, a new invention that would liberate map-making. Suddenly, maps could be reproduced en masse rather than being redrawn by hand. At the same time, the world had rediscovered Ptolemy. Prior to the destruction of the Alexandrian library, copies of Ptolemy's geography were spirited away by Arab Muslims. In the late 1300s, they were uncovered in Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey. Thanks to the printing press, 12 centuries after it was written, geography was suddenly enjoying mass distribution. Combined with the liberated thinking of the Renaissance, the Old World stood poised to discover the New World.
Before this Renaissance view, the ocean was considered the circular body that confined the world. Some of the savants in Florence began to hear about the world way out there and read Ptolemy and began to conceive of the oceans being a medium for communications, not for imprisonment. It was a liberating concept, and liberation is what it takes to go forward.
Ironically, it was an error of Ptolemy's that in 1492 emboldened Christopher Columbus to cross the Atlantic in search of a short route to Asia. While he understood the spherical nature of the Earth, Ptolemy had drastically underestimated its circumference.
This is a reduced facsimile of a manuscript globe that was made in Germany in 1492. It's doubtful that Columbus ever saw this globe, or the original. It's now in Nuremberg, but he certainly may well have seen something like it. Now, because Ptolemy had very badly underestimated the size of the Earth, the diameter of the Earth, and had overestimated the length of the Mediterranean and the whole length of Asia, by the time you mapped a too large continent onto a too small globe, you end up with a very short distance between Spain here and Japan here. And so I think it demonstrates beautifully how what Columbus obviously had in mind when he sailed west here from Spain across the Atlantic, and he struck some islands which he quite naturally assumed were off the mainland of China. He spent the rest of his career, his next 3 voyages, trying to discover the mainland that he was convinced was there.
Thinking it was Asia, Columbus most likely landed in the Bahamas. To add insult to injury, when another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, first theorized that Columbus had founded a new continent, prominent German mapmaker Martin Waldseemüller named the new land not after Columbus, but America, in honor of Vespucci. The name stuck. However, the journeys of Columbus and his contemporaries would lead to a new age of precision mapping and a white lie that would permeate cartography for the next 500 years. The United States Geological Survey in Reston, Virginia, is the most advanced and prolific map-making entity that the world has ever seen. The agency runs its own printing plant where every week about 500,000 maps come off the presses. "200-pound stacks of maps are positioned with ease as they float on a bed of air before being trimmed to size on an automatic cutting machine. Another machine does what so many of us fail to do. It folds the maps with neat and orderly creases. But there is no machine or technology that can ever change one truth about map making.
The map is like every other human form, flawed. You should bear in mind when you look at a map that it is a compromise. If you're going to have a completely reliable and accurate map of reality, it would have to be on a scale of 1 to 1, which of course defeats the purpose.
Every map contains a geographical lie, a compromise that comes from trying to project the geography of a round world onto a flat surface. The most common and longest running white lie in map making is called the Greenland problem. On many world maps, the island of Greenland appears as large as South America. The reason for this dates back to a time shortly after Columbus's journeys to the New World. The European invasion of the Americas created a demand for accurate navigational maps. Yet mapmakers still struggled with precision. They could draw shapes of land masses based on the observations of explorers. But their problem was with projection, an accurate directional representation of a big round world on a small flat piece of paper. In 1569, a Flemish geographer named Gerardus Mercator used mathematics and his own intuition to develop a new projection system, one that would not only serve the Pilgrims when they sailed to America 50 years later, but would be one of the most popular projections for the next 500 years.
This is one of the first printed editions of Mercator's world map on his new projection. It's still basically the rectangular world map that most of us have seen in many a book and atlas and probably had hanging up on the walls of our schools.
Mercator's projection made it possible for navigators to draw straight lines between 2 points and use compass bearings to steer between them. The compromise is that in order to straighten the curving lines of the poles, the upper and lower land masses of the map are exaggerated. The result is the Greenland problem. The navigational benefits, however, vastly outweighed the distortion. Mercator's projection is still used by navigators today. About 100 years after Mercator devised his projection, an Italian cartographer named Jean-Dominique Cassini was employed by the King of France to map the nation. It was to be done with a level of scientific accuracy never before achieved. To accomplish this, Cassini devised a system based on geometry. If you know the length of one side and 2 of the angles of a triangle, you can calculate the length of the other 2 sides. Thus, taking triangular measurements meant he wouldn't have to travel to every point he mapped. As innovative as his idea was, mapping France was still an extremely complex and time-consuming task. It took 100 years. Cassini was relieved by his son and his grandson, until finally his great-grandson completed and published the map set in 1745. Tied together by triangles, this map provides the basis for large-scale topographic mapping.
So the kings of France, just about the time they lost their kingdom, to the Revolution finally had a good map of their kingdom.
The French monarchy certainly would not be the first or last to see their maps altered due to revolution or war. But thanks to Mercator and Cassini, cartography had a new scientific foundation on which to chart the future. America's oldest map maker, Rand McNally, still produces conventional fold-out and book-style road maps from their headquarters in Skokie, Illinois. But now, long trips can be planned down to the smallest detail on CD-ROMs. These products make it possible to plan a trip based on a variety of factors, including sightseeing possibilities, road construction, and even traffic congestion patterns. William Rand and Andrew McNally could probably have never dreamt of such possibilities when they started a small Chicago printing firm in 1856. Since Chicago was a boom town for the railroad industry, they began printing train tickets 5 years prior to the Civil War. In 1872, they expanded to printing pocket-sized timetable guides for train lines. It was in these booklets that the first Rand McNally maps appeared. They were fold-out maps of the nation's train routes. They listed every populated city, train station, and mail stop on a state-by-state basis. But in the 1890s, Rand and McNally were capitalizing on another transportation boom, the bicycle. They began printing bike maps which showed the best bicycle paths in cities all over the country. Shortly after, the invention of the automobile heralded a brand new type of map, the photo auto guide.
This is one of Rand McNally's photo auto guides, they were called. It was an early 20th century attempt to help the motorists get around.
The guides used a series of photographs to show the routes between specific cities. They captured landmarks at key intersections and used arrows to indicate the proper direction. The founder's son, Andrew McNally II, actually photographed the Chicago to Milwaukee route himself while on his honeymoon. Autophoto guides, though, would soon give way to more familiar maps.
In 1914, Rand McNally was actually asked to make maps for the first gas stations in Pennsylvania. And this began the entrance of Rand McNally into what became the road map industry.
With more American automobile drivers taking to the roads, Rand McNally was soon printing more complex maps and road atlases. One of the biggest obstacles to mapping America's roads was that many of them were unmarked or only went by local names. A map draftsman, Martin Brink, devised a solution that resulted in Rand McNally's Blazed Trails series of maps. The Blazed Trails map assigned a reference number to each highway. The map contained a key that matched that number to the highway's name and a unique symbol designed by Rand McNally. The company's own employees painted the symbols on roadside utility poles all across the country. 20 years after the first Blazed Trails maps, Rand McNally would face an overwhelming demand for another kind of map. During World War II, maps were critical to virtually every aspect of battle. General Dwight Eisenhower used a Mercator projection map to plot a landing point on the coast of France for what would be one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century, the 1944 D-Day invasion. Adolf Hitler read a map and wrongly predicted that the attack would come from another flank. But from the very start of the war, Americans back home eager for news relied not only on radio, but also on maps. In 1939, within 24 hours of German troops marching into Poland, Rand McNally's supply of European maps was exhausted. The company's printing presses worked around the clock to produce World War II maps, As once independent nations became occupied territories, cartographers would reflect those changes on the maps. Map and globe production would continue 24 hours a day throughout the entire war.
There was a great interest in the public's side to know what's where, what's the status of the battles, what's the status of who is in fact now occupying what area.
Besides the major theaters of battle, Rand McNally's World War II maps also included special sections. They were devoted to military hardware such as battleships, the types of uniforms worn by the different armies fighting the war, and other features. Maps help families back home feel closer to their loved ones overseas. Some of the same technology that aided the Allied forces in winning the war would forever alter map-making. Aerial photography was used as early as the Civil War, when pictures were taken out of hot air balloons for reconnaissance. Wilbur Wright himself took the first aerial photograph from an airplane in 1909. Though it wasn't until World War II that both the aircraft and cameras were sophisticated enough to actually make maps from the images.
So that was another major revolution. You no longer had to go out and measure everything on the ground. You could start measuring things in aerial photographs.
The British invention of radar was one of the most important technological advances to emerge from the war. Without the ability to detect Hitler's powerful air and naval forces from miles away, the outcome of the war could have been much different.
In the post-war period, radar was this emerging technology, and soon people in aviation and in the military and in cartography began to realize that here was something that enabled you to do something that hadn't been done before, which is to map the unseen.
Following the war, cartographers from the U.S. military and Latin American nations embarked on a major mapping expedition made possible only by radar. Most of Central and South America's vast forest and mountain ranges had never been measured by even the most fundamental surveying tools. But now, ground crews could bounce radar signals off faraway objects and measure the distance of the signal's rebound. Teams of U.S. and Latin American cartographers interviewed forest-dwelling natives to learn the names of rarely seen and never-before-mapped geographical areas. While early radar technology made it possible to map these remote sections of the Earth, 50 years later, radar would advance to mapping other worlds. This is a simulated flyover of Venus. It's also an accurate topographical map. It was created by combining computer graphics with a radar imaging device on board the NASA space probe Magellan. Venus is Earth's closest neighbor and is similar in size and distance from the Sun, but it is shrouded by dense gaseous clouds. The planet's surface is penetrable only by radar. Magellan began its orbit around Venus in May of 1990. In thousands of radar bursts that last less than a second, Magellan acquired enough information to make detailed images of the Venusian surface. It transferred the data to NASA's Deep Space Network dishes, which then transmitted it to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. There, 15-foot-long image strips were combined with computer graphics to create the flyover. Magellan has revealed the presence of enormous volcanoes, about 30 times more than the number found on Earth. And then there is Artemis, a 4,000-mile-long lava channel. Scientists can use this mapping data to learn more about the formation of Venus. And in the process of getting to know our neighbor, they might learn more about the Earth's formation. But back on Earth, maps are being used for more pressing matters. When a disaster strikes, the first response is to aid the victims. A secondary response is to find ways to mitigate future damage.
Maps are absolutely necessary to do that, because what needs to be done, you need to have first a base of where all the populations are now, where the infrastructure is now, where the roads, where the telecommunications networks are now. Then you also have to know where the places are most at risk. Once those are done, you can identify the overlaps, where people are at risk.
This is where disasters are mapped. The Center for Integration of Natural Disaster Information, or CINDI. It's located in the Reston, Virginia headquarters of the U.S. Geological Survey. CINDI was on full alert in 1993 when record rainfalls inundated 31 U.S. states and 3 Canadian provinces along the Mississippi floodplain. Damage was in the billions of dollars. 500 counties were declared disaster areas. Maps were needed not only to aid rescue crews, but to plan for the future. USGS aerial photography teams took to the sky to begin mapping the damage.
That aerial photography has been used for identifying places where bridges have been washed out, places where communities have been isolated, places where rivers have changed course, and doing damage assessments like that.
In addition, satellite imagery was obtained for a wider view of the damage. When combined with the aerial photography and other data at the CINDI lab, cartographers create computer-generated maps that tell a story. They portray the Mississippi floodplain prior to the '93 storms. They show the dramatic swelling of the floodplains and finally the severe erosion that was caused as the water receded. These maps will not only assist in restoring the floodplain, but also in the future planning of cities and homes. These mapping techniques are not only employed during disasters. The USGS is constantly updating maps to reflect geographical change. New strips of aerial photography taken from all over the nation are constantly being analyzed for quality by USGS cartographers. Next, they're optically corrected for any distortion caused by the landscape, light refraction, or the camera lens. The result is a digital orthophoto quadrangle, or DOQ. It is a measurably correct photo map. The DOQ is layered over a digital raster graphic, a computer-scanned image of an older map. Cartographers can alter the lines on the digital raster graphic to match geographical changes seen on the DOQ. The older map will then be reprinted with the corrections intact. Now, newer technologies are changing the entire concept of what a map can be. The folded or misfolded maps that for decades have been stored in glove compartments are giving way to satellite-powered guidance systems installed in automobiles.
Left turn ahead.
More than just a map, it's a sort of co-piloting navigator. When a desired address is entered, the system displays a road map.
Please proceed to the highlighted route.
It shows the current position of the automobile, the streets immediately surrounding it, and the direction to proceed toward. Once the car is moving, the display changes to easy-to-see directional arrows, while a voice prompt
Freeway entrance ahead on the right
alerts the driver to upcoming turns. The system can also provide a real-time map of the car's route. The actual position of the automobile is indicated by a traveling green triangle. Some products, like the Magellan Navigator, even provide directories to points of interest, such as restaurants. Select a location category and the system will display nearby possibilities and then guide you to your choice. All of this is made possible by 24 orbiting satellites that comprise the Global Positioning System, or GPS.
The Global Positioning System was a concept developed by the Defense Department to enable them to better locate their assets during battle. That is, they wanted to be able to precisely locate where American troops, facilities, and assets were, and also know where enemy troops, facility, assets were.
Developed in the 1970s, the effectiveness of GPS was most dramatically displayed in the 1991 Gulf War. Fighter pilots used GPS to both locate targets and guide their missiles under the secure cover of darkness. Commanders on the other side of the world could pinpoint the location of every soldier, tank, and other military vehicles to within 15 feet. The satellites that power GPS are a high-tech variation of triangulation, the method used to map France 3 centuries earlier. The 24 GPS satellites are constantly orbiting the Earth. Each one emanates a timing signal to a specific zone, effectively covering the entire planet. Atomic clocks time exactly how long the signal takes to travel to the Earth and rebound back to the satellite. When a ground receiver, such as one installed in an automobile, detects at least 3 of these signals, it can analyze their frequency and determine an exact location based on latitude, longitude, and altitude. Since the computers in GPS receivers are programmed with corresponding points of specific blocks on Earth, they can provide the digital directions from one point to another. Other mapping applications of GPS can save lives. Emergency response teams use GPS to immediately calculate the quickest route to any disaster location. Meanwhile, GPS provides dispatchers with picture-perfect knowledge of where all their emergency vehicles are located, with real-time accuracy.
The maps of today are no longer merely the drawings and ideas of 1 or 2 people who have gone out and explored an area. They're now the culmination of 1,000 years or 2,000 years of technology that has measured the Earth, has gathered information about the people on the Earth, the places on the Earth, and is continuing to gather information about the people and places on the Earth using everything from aerial photography to satellite means, and people still going out and using the most traditional, the most classic methods of gathering that information. We haven't lost using any of the technologies. We've just added to all of those technologies.